Guys, it's the end of an era. The UFC is no longer on ESPN, and I think it'd be right to start this podcast. What? I know, man. It's a damn shame. I think
How
it's.
can I even be hot?
Are you a little emotional about it? Are you emotional?
Well,
We're gonna get you crying on the show.
I started with the UFC on ESPN, so
That's true. Yeah.
on one hand, it's emotional on that one. On the other hand, it hasn't been that long enough. I think my come up is really going to be with the Paramount era. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see with that one. But, 2019 to 2025, the ESPN era is officially over. And I think it'd be right to start the podcast with a little moment of silence for our friends at ESPN and the ESPN UFC era as a whole. So let's do that real fast. It was an up and down era. Gotta show some love to the infamous ESPN commercial break screen. The silent one, kind of like this moment of silence. Actually, this moment of silence is a little bit louder than the ESPN commercial break screen. Rest in peace to the commercial break screen. I'll miss how often the ESPN app glitched, especially during pay-per-views, most notably UFC 313, worldwide leader in sports. And that's what we got. It's amazing. All right, we got to talk about this because in all seriousness,
yeah,
in
in all seriousness,
there was some good,
it's
there was
time
some
to
bad.
get to
We
the
got to talk
nitty-gritty.
about it. Yeah. So my opinion in the end is honestly the ESPN partnership with the UFC in some ways was really successful. I think, there were a lot of new fans because of ESPN. And at the end of the day, we're messing around about the app and all that. Still the worldwide leader. A lot of people around the world are paying attention to ESPN, and that did bring some eyeballs to the UFC, especially in 2020. But on the other hand, it was a massive disappointment just because it felt like the UFC got very stale in this ESPN era. And the way that ESPN kind of covered the sport was a bit clunky at times. It felt like kind of like poorly prepared research papers when it would get to the shows like First Take and whatever else people watch nowadays on ESPN. But I think that in other ways too, the pricing alienated a lot of people and definitely blew up Stream East. But I just think that the main thing that I feel about ESPN is it felt very soulless watching the UFC on there a lot of times. All of the promotion was very similar for every fighter. It didn't feel like the era before ESPN where everything felt bigger and special. This just felt like, another card. Let's make more money and keep it moving. And I hope that the Paramount deal changes that a little bit. But it really just seemed like ESPN kind of phoned in at times with the UFC. And, you add that with how often the app would glitch and just all of the problems with that. I mean, like I said, UFC 313, that was the most notable disaster when in the middle of that pay-per-view, ESPN app starts glitching, but then it's working fine on Stream East. Like, that's not a good thing. And apparently the UFC was very angry about that. But yeah, man, that's kind of where I'm at with it. I feel mixed things about it because, like I said, it's just
Look, I let you say your piece and give it for the good and the bad and everything in between, but I'm not gonna let you be. I'm not gonna let you be partial to it. By the end of this video, by the end of this conversation, you are going to give a definitive answer whether or not it was an L or it was a W. And you know what? I even let you give a time frame for maybe like you can explain the peaks, like the absolute peak of the UFC on ESPN when it was at its very best. And you can talk about when it was really, and maybe you just did right there with UFC 313, but you can
it
also,
was a valley, that's for sure. That was a deep, deep valley, Grand Canyon level.
yeah,
Valley.
yeah, yeah, you can go in depth about the the bad parts, the absolute bottom of the ESPN era. But because let's be honest with ourselves when it comes to ESPN itself, and it's just something that it's just a network that you expect the best in and out from in each it's a billion-dollar company. It's got all, I mean, even just thinking back to when they let go of all these employees on their staff for budget cuts, whatever it might be. I thought that was entirely ridiculous because I always thought ESPN would be the place that there should just be more and more opportunity, not less and less opportunity. And so when they adopt as many sports as they can, no matter how niche it is, including MMA, yeah, because it's PFL as well. You just want it to be like the reason, you want it to be the reason why a casual mainstream audience is also able to get into the sport and be enthralled by it. And it did have those moments when they would air on ABC for free fight night cards. And that was something that was really encouraging, and that all filtered through ESPN. But it's just one of those things where I always felt like there was more to gain from it. More, and then instead of that, it just felt like they were becoming, and just naturally, just corporate businesses become more and more greedy and more and more greedy and just strict on how they want to run their operation. And this was no different with ESPN, the UFC on ESPN, and even for the UFC brass themselves, in terms of just kind of because of the contract they were signed to, just feeling like instead of making every card feel special in its own unique way, you just feel like, well, we have to put a card this week because their contract says we have to. And that kind of just, it takes away from, especially MMA, where
I think those stories matter a lot more. Like, it's not like when you're watching like baseball, it's the Yankees versus the Red Sox. You're talking about a team, you're talking about a record. Like fighting, it's truly an individual sport. And yes, obviously there's coaches and, there's teams and stuff like that in gyms where people train. But at the end of the day, it's one person in that cage. And it was ESPN's job to make them feel like a superstar. And it just felt like we were getting the same promos every single week. And part of that is the UFC's fault because, I remember when they would announce fights with like these giant TV packages during fight nights or pay-per-views during like the Fox era or the Spike era. But on ESPN, now we get Dana White sitting in his office on Instagram. And it's honestly sad to me seeing how many new fans enjoy that and like view that as a big thing that they should anticipate, because they weren't there when the UFC was on Fox or when it was on Spike. And I get it when that's what you're used to, why it doesn't seem like it's that big of a problem. But when the UFC is going on ESPN to really break through that glass ceiling, and then it kind of doesn't because of the soulless promotion of the sport on there, I just think that people are, at least the hardcore fans that have been around for a while, really saw that under the ESPN era. And like,
yeah, and you can't pull a fast one on those kinds of fans.
Yeah, well, because they've been there. They know what they want. They know what blew the sport up. And ESPN kind of turned the UFC into any other sport, when in the UFC is truly a one-of-one type of brand. And instead of that, ESPN kind of just put it in the rotation with every other sport. And like I said, it's not like they didn't try to give it its shine here and there. Like they would put Dana White, Daniel Cormier on shows like First Take or even Pat McAfee. And like, I'll give McAfee a little bit more credit because it seemed like they were really trying to make it into into something you should get more hyped about. But like at the end of the day, Pat McAfee's a football guy. He doesn't know everything about MMA. So you would get Dana White going on Pat McAfee and talking about Conor McGregor, who hasn't fought since 2021, or John Jones, who is sort of retired, not retired. And then you're not really talking as much about the stars of today that, you know, they're the ones who are technically paying the bills, because you were talking about that contract. They're putting on 41 cards a year. I'd rather hear more about the guys who are actually fighting multiple times a year than wondering if someone who hasn't fought in a few years is going to return. And I don't know, that's like kind of one thing. You can't totally hate on ESPN, because there were a lot of good fights and moments under the banner. Like, got multiple Conor McGregor fights in the ESPN era, multiple John Jones fights, you know, big names formed in the ESPN era. We had Pereira, Volk, Israel Adesanya, Kamaru Usman, Jorge Masvidal. I mean, like, I can keep going when it comes to that. You know, Hamzat. And I think that, I just think that we have those huge names, but they don't feel as big as the Conor McGregors of the world that were built before ESPN. And you'd think when the UFC joins ESPN that this is how they're going to, like I said, break through the glass ceiling. But it just didn't feel like they did that. It felt very flat. And then, you know, you get into those valleys where UFC 313 is glitching in the middle of a pay-per-view, and then it's working on Stream East and not on the ESPN app, you know. And like I said, just very soulless promotion, no creativity behind it. It's just the same packages every single week. And like I said, the UFC and MMA as a whole is a one-of-one type of sport and industry, and ESPN just put it in their corporate rotation. And now you're seeing the UFC leaving. I think they've been having problems with the MLB. Formula One is leaving ESPN. So this isn't even just a UFC problem. This is just an ESPN problem. And, you know, I'm bashing it. And I'm really not bashing the UFC. I'm bashing ESPN, because I think they could have just done a much better job than they did. It had so much potential. That didn't work.
I think that's what the conversation should be centered around, because otherwise we wouldn't be talking about this if they weren't moving to a whole different streaming model. You know what I mean? So it is, ESPN is at the center of it all. It can't just be, well, how about the UFC itself and how it did under ESPN. UFC, well,
can I actually say that I just thought of this based on like what you were kind of starting to say there? Like, you know, we were talking about peaks and valleys, right? I would call the peak of ESPN probably like the middle of the pandemic in 2020, when the UFC was the only sport on the air. But that's not ESPN that did that. They broadcasted them, sure, but the UFC put on those fights. So like ESPN's biggest peak, they don't even really deserve credit for.
Yeah. All this to say that I think UFC, as much as ESPN propped them up and gave him the huge budget and all this worldwide fame and attention, and it's grown into the global phenomenon that we know it as today. On the other side of it, I think the UFC was probably boxed in by this contract. They couldn't really expand and put together. So, for instance, we were on the Royval Cape recap. We were talking about how Dana doesn't even value the rankings anymore. Now he doesn't even care about them, and it's like, well, why are they even here? I think in the future, and if they really want, especially because now that there's not going to be pay-per-view numbers to sell and whatnot, and all that, that's now the whole big thing. I think with the new deal that, in a way, well, we'll see how much, because, okay, yeah, they're very busy people, but hopefully that they can innovate more. I think the ESPN contract more or less kind of boxed them in where they couldn't really innovate, perhaps, and like
it's hard to be creative when you don't even have a full week to promote the next week's fight. You have 41 weeks out of the year where you're having a fight card. It's kind of hard to make those cards feel special.
Yeah, ESPN is to say, hey, you sign the best fighters in the world, and here you go. We have a platform that they will, they will perform on.
And then we'll promote them.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll promote them for a few days, give them the same promotion that everybody else gets. Nothing to make them feel individual and like a superstar, one of one. But we're just going to put them all in the rotation. That's what it really felt like. It just felt like a giant rotation. Just
it was like, well, like people like us, like you're gonna watch anyways. So it was like, but it's like, no, because yes, we're gonna watch, but because we care about, the fighters themselves. We care about those guys and girls that are going in cage to put everything on the line for an ultimate goal.
But the thing is, ESPN isn't the reason why we care about those fighters, and that's a problem.
And those corporate big heads are just can be so full of themselves and egotistical because they have so much power and money that they feel like that they are the ones that are driving why it's growing. And yes, you get it on the platform and all that, and a lot of people have never gotten into UFC if not for ESPN. But
the thing, even with that though, like I think that a lot of the new fans, they came during the ESPN era, but a lot of it was during the pandemic when the UFC was the only sports league putting on events. And that's not something that ESPN deserves credit for. Like the UFC could have still been on Fox when that happened. You know what I mean? So I think that ESPN gets a lot of credit for bringing new fans into the sport, but they don't really deserve it. I think the UFC deserves that credit. Yeah. So ESPN, I remember they were kind of talking back then. They weren't really sure if it was even a good idea for the UFC to do that. So it's just, I don't know, like this whole era just kind of left me with a bad taste in my mouth. Cause I think about when I got into the sport, when it was on Fox, you really felt like every card mattered and it wasn't so oversaturated. Like, don't get me wrong. I love that we get fights pretty much every weekend at this point, but ESPN never really gave the fights time to breathe. And I don't know if Paramount's going to do that. It seems like Paramount's going to be pretty active too, but we've talked before. They might have smaller cards to kind of combat that problem where it's like you don't have fighters to main event every week. But we'll see what happens with that. But what's up, guys? Sorry to interrupt the podcast real quick, but we have a message for you guys.
If you enjoy her Hamburg's content, you want to see more, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like on the videos, all sorts of fight content as much as possible, podcasts, interviews, vlogs. We have it all over here, so thank you, appreciate it.
We appreciate you, and like he said, please subscribe, and now back to the show. Like I said, and you know what's crazy? We're talking about the promotion and the problems with the streaming. We haven't even talked about how expensive ESPN Plus was towards the end, and Paramount is literally going to be $1,000 cheaper to be a UFC fan per year. Even if the price goes up by a bunch, it's still going to be way cheaper. Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned corporate greed, and it's not like ESPN doesn't have enough money. They're owned by Disney, so I don't think they're running out of money anytime soon. Yeah, so that's the thing. It should never, and it's not, hopefully, not even hopefully, now it's going to be, okay, if someone doesn't want to watch a certain card, it's not because they just don't want to pay for it and they're not interested enough in the main event. It's going to just, it's just going to be because like they're just not going to find the time to watch the card, because now you don't have, like, because there were, like, you could see it in the comment sections of posts and stuff, like, people saying like, oh, I'm just gonna skip this one, and that has to do with because you still have to pay to watch the card, and now it's unfair to the fighters fighting on that card because, well, I don't think it's particularly on. Well, how many times have you talked about the Apex, dude? Like, and that's not really ESPN's fault, but like ESPN. Well, actually, I shouldn't even say that because the UFC runs their own production, even though it airs on ESPN. But like, when I look at the ESPN era, I just see a silent arena in the UFC Apex, and I see too many fight nights where people aren't excited about the main event. It's actually the opposite, where people are complaining about the main events. And like you said, saying, I'm not even going to bother watching this card because it has no effect on the title implications of a division, or it doesn't even have a top prospect or an interesting contender involved. And when you have ESPN just kind of giving that same soulless promo that they'd give for a random Apex card, and they give maybe like a half a step above that for a pay-per-view,
Yeah,
it's just kind of rough.
it should never be like that because not every even if you're well, if Conor McGregor were to say he's fighting the main event of a card tomorrow, just about every single fan's gonna be tuned into it. But every fighter's different. Every fighter has a different style. At the end of the day, they all have the same goal: is to get their hand raised after every single bout that they're in, and that's it. Whether it's their style or what, like they are there to do a job, and it's not really fair to them that it's like, well, because a fan is not that interested in them, it's really like, okay, well, now they're on me on Paramount, me streaming, like a fan could just be able to turn on their their Paramount Plus whenever if they have the time to do so, and it's just kind of check out the card, just even if they don't watch the entire thing, the entire fight, they're just kind of just taking a look at it and whatnot, and then perhaps at a little bit later, they're going to check out the whole thing. With the ESPN, it's not going to be like that. You can't because you have to buy the car. You have to buy it first if you want to even just check it out for a little bit. So that's not going to be the case anymore. So it wasn't really all that fair to fighters either, who kind of just got thrust onto, even if it's an Apex card, some random Apex card, but even some pay-per-views felt, there was, even some pay-per-views felt less special than others. And yeah, for obvious reasons, like obviously UFC 300 has to be more stacked than UFC freaking 312, something like that. So that's kind of this natural part that comes with it. But I think now that all I have to say is that this new era it's kind of just like a clean slate for not only the UFC but all the fighters within the roster. They all get to make, they all essentially get to make like another first impression in a way, a new impression, and just kind of just bring that flair that they've always had within themselves as fighters, but now it gets to really put UFC as a whole just serious must-see TV.
Well, it's exciting when it goes on a new platform, or even when they went on ESPN for the first time, with all the way back in 2019, when you look at Cejudo versus Dillashaw on that first UFC fight night, and you got a championship fight for free. It was phenomenal, and there's always a lot of anticipation and excitement for a new broadcast era. And when I think about ESPN, like there's so many disappointments, obviously, as we've gotten into, and there's some successes, but at the end of the day, I also think that the ESPN era was kind of fated to fail in a way because of just the changing of the times. Like when the UFC wanted to go on ESPN, ESPN really was still like the worldwide leader in sports. A lot of people still had cable. So the thought was like, well, now the UFC is going to be on the biggest sports station on cable television. But then in that time period, cable kind of went away and we went more towards streaming, and then the ESPN app was horrible and it was glitching all the time. And that's a big problem. And, the UFC signed with ESPN because they wanted more exposure. And at the end of the day, I think they got less of it because people didn't really want to pay for the ESPN app because it was so bad. And like I said, the time when the UFC did get the most exposure in the ESPN era wasn't even really because of ESPN. It was because of a pandemic that nobody could have predicted or controlled. So I just think that the thing that you can give ESPN the most credit for, you almost can't give them credit for that. And I don't know if it's their fault or if it's just the changing of the times, but at the end of the day, I really do think that it just fell flat. And while we got new stars from this era, nothing really feels like it was because of ESPN. It just feels like ESPN was where it was broadcasted, which obviously is very important. They need a platform to fight on. But still, I think that all of the success that ESPN had with the UFC was because of the UFC and not because of ESPN. So that's just how I feel. And I hope that the Paramount era is a lot better. I think it will be. I mean, obviously they really wanted the UFC. They paid $7.7 billion for the streaming rights. And now the UFC is committed to a full streaming platform and not really cable as much, although there will be cards on CBS. But I like that for not a pay-per-view anymore, a numbered card or a fight night, you could just go on the Paramount Plus app and then just watch the UFC. God, that sounded like an ad right there. You could just tap one button. It's that easy. But genuinely, like I said, there's a lot of excitement anytime they're changing broadcast partners. And, the thought now is, what can Paramount add that ESPN didn't?
Yeah.
And I'm excited.
So back to the innovation part of it all, and how ESPN likely, in my opinion, most likely more or less boxed UFC in, and it's just, hey, it's that simple. Like, hey, this is what you signed for, and this is the agreements that you signed to and agreed to, and that's it. That's all we need to keep. Like, even with the pandemic happening and how UFC is the only event now, like you said, you nailed it on the head. Like, that's not because of ESPN. It's because that's because of the UFC. And
I would say, like, on social media is the only way that ESPN probably truly affected the UFC in that point of time. Because like I said, it does matter that they're on there, because, you still have ESPN MMA posting about it. You get more clips on Sports Center and stuff like that. But again, I just feel like people aren't really as into that as they were when they initially got to ESPN. It really all happened in the middle of that time period, that big shift in where people want to watch sports. And so that's I started this podcast, it sounded like I was on the fence. I'm really not on the fence. I think that this era was more disappointing than it was good, but at the end of the day, I just don't know if it was fully ESPN's fault. I think some of it was. I think some of it is just, though, the changing of the times in terms of how people
because now I think UFC just, because now we talked about how other outside promotions and wanting that competition for UFC, and so that MMA as a whole could be so much more accessible and something that people are just interested in and want more and more of, because there is already so much of it, but the other promotions are just nowhere near the UFC's level. And so because this ESPN deal was obviously set in stone, and all the cards are set and all that, like, there's no real incentive to, like, put on, just do whatever, once again, the innovation, and think of all these ideas and stack these cards as much as every card as much as possible, top to bottom, with the absolute best fights that they can. Like, that, there was just no real incentive to do that. There's no other promotion that's holding a candle to what they're doing. So now I think I'm hoping that this is going to, it's going to reignite that flame maybe a little bit in Dana White, and he's going to sit down and he's going to try and think of ways to maybe innovate in all these ideas. For one, make the rankings feel more important.
Actually, he said earlier this year that they were going to have AI fix the ranking. That never happened. So, like, I don't even think that that's on his mind. But
I just think there's, all in all, this to say that there's just so many dimensions to MMA as it is, and I think obviously UFC being the best at what they do in terms of obviously mixed martial arts promotion, and getting the best of the very best, not only getting the very best of the best on their roster, but matching them up with each other in the most optimal, ideal matchups, which they seem to always do, and it's always a good.
Not lately, though. Not lately. There's been a lot of interesting title fights being made lately. A lot of contenders getting skipped. We're talking about the UFC. That's not ESPN.
True, because now as we do go into this new era on Paramount, they are going to sway more towards just flat out entertainment. Like the most popular fighters or whatnot are likely gonna get.
See how that does for you.
Yeah. So
I mean, I'll say this, like, my biggest issue with the ESPN era for the UFC is that they went on there to get more eyeballs into the sport and more hardcore fans. But yet, when I talk to the average person about the UFC, they don't know anything more than they knew before the UFC was on ESPN. Like when I see people when we go out and stuff like that, and people ask us about the podcast and how all that's going, they don't know anything more about the UFC than they did before 2019. So ESPN really wasn't that instrumental in making it even bigger than it was. And that's kind of the big problem to me, considering the expectations going in were so high. And I just feel like they felt flat. And, you know, we got a lot of cards that didn't feel big at all. And fans are still basically, I hate to say it, there's still like a lot of casuals out there. And ESPN didn't really do a good job at making those casuals into hardcore fans, which is ultimately their job at the end of the day, is draw them in and keep them hooked on the sport. Might have drawn a few people in, but they didn't really create any new hardcore, well, many new hardcore fans.
Yeah.
So, and considering the expectations were that high going in, I don't know. I think it wasn't really well executed, but I still think that some of that is just because of how much the landscape of how people consume sports have changed since the UFC arrived there. But it's the end of an era. You know, I think we've talked about all the good, all the bad. But, you know, we have 7 years now on Paramount. So we're going to be seeing that for a very long time, what it seems like. So you have to hope that it's going to be a lot better. And obviously that's always the goal, is when you change broadcast partners, it has to be bigger and better. So hopefully Paramount can, you know, build on some of ESPN's shortcomings at the end of it all. And I guess we'll see what happens, honestly. But we'll see what happens next year. But the UFC's year is over. And, obviously we had our last fight recap earlier in the week. And, this is really putting a bow on it, talking about the end of the ESPN era here. But, next year we're going to be on Paramount.
I think it's pretty cool. It's not something that's just happening for no reason, just because they can, just because Paramount can, just because UFC can.
Well, they're leaning into the times. Like, everything's getting streamed now, so you might as well just go with a stream. And if you remember, it was between Paramount and Netflix, so like it wasn't like ESPN or the UFC was talking to other cable networks. And obviously Paramount owns CBS, but still, like, the deal is to mainly have fights on Paramount Plus and have every fight on Paramount Plus, rather than ESPN, which was you have to pay the monthly cost for the app, and then you're paying another, what was it, $70, $80 by the end of it per pay-per-view. So now that they're leaning more into this, I think it's better. I think fans are excited for it. It's something new. How could you not be excited for something new?
Yeah.
And like I said, the beginning of the ESPN era was exciting, and fell a little flat towards the end, but just is what it is. And we'll see what happens with the Paramount era. But, that'll be it for this video. Won't be it for us this year. I think the next thing we put out will be our end of year special, hand out some yearly awards, and reflect on some of our favorite memories of the year that was in combat sports. And that was fun to do last year, and I think it'll be fun this time. And like I said, we'll definitely be putting out some content over the break, and we have some fun stuff planned for 2026. So let us know what you guys thought of the ESPN era, because I don't know, I wonder if a lot of people agree with us. My thing, I feel like a lot of the hardcore fans probably feel more like we do, but I don't know if the casual fans would agree with us. And I shouldn't say casual fans, but like newer fans is the word I'm looking for. I feel like they maybe might not agree, because, kind of like you said, you got into the UFC during the ESPN era. So for some of them, that's how they know the sport, and maybe because of that, they love it. But I think, what's the thing that people always say? Comparison is the biggest thief of joy. So like, I'm comparing the ESPN era to the past. So the Fox era, the Spike era. So maybe that's just making me a little bit jaded towards what they did on ESPN. But hey, I'm curious what everybody thinks. Obviously, we put out our opinion in this video, for better or for worse. We'll see if we get flamed. But hey, let us know what you guys think in the comments. Please subscribe if you enjoyed, and we'll see you all next time.